My name's Mark Kramer. I'm Director of Cold War Studies here at Harvard, and I was one of the four co-organizers led by Andrea Graziosi. And so I'm very pleased to be taking part in today's workshop. I actually, in these last three panels, have roles to play after watching from up there. So the first session for which I'm chairing deals with the economy, the impact of the war on the Ukrainian economy. And we are fortunate to have an excellent, really top-notch expert, Vladyslav Rashkovan, who is has had a long career in as an economist, expert on macroeconomics and finance. He is currently working for the International Monetary Fund, but he has also had senior posts in the Ukrainian government, especially the Ukrainian National Bank, for which he was deputy governor. His role currently is in dealing with macroeconomics and finance in both wartime Ukraine and post-war. So with that, please, Vlad.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark, for having me. And maybe I will start with this slide, which is a part of another presentation of mine, which I showed recently in Bundesbank, actually saying about that the war is multidimensional, and it has different arenas, different things at stake, different lenses through which we need to look at this. I'm happy later to comment maybe after the presentation about that. But what I wanted to use this slide for is to thank Harvard, thank all the team who is behind the today event, because indeed today's event shows multidimensional elements of the war, and I will speak more about the economic element. There was an interesting interview of your colleague at Harvard and my former colleague Gita Gopinath, at Davos, where she said that when you look at the economy, global economy, and looking about growth is 3.1, 3.3% of economic growth that time when she was speaking about, she said that looks like nothing has changed in the economy. Perception is that nothing has changed because this is the same growth as it was before, let's say before 2025. But indeed, everything has changed. And I believe that in the Ukrainian economy, everything has changed in the last 4 or 5 years, even if some people may believe, may look like that not everything, not that many things changed. So let me focus on a few elements of the economic impact of the war, starting from war damages, impact on GDP, on trade, on inflation, where we stand in the banking sector, reserves, and international aid, and maybe add a little bit in the reconstruction planning, but probably we'll discuss it in another panel later, if possible. So having said that, the impact of the Russia's war on the economy is devastating. We have around 6 million people of externally displaced people, and it has been discussed already. There is also 4.7 million of registered IDPs, so which actually brings together as 25%, 1/4 of the pre-war population is somehow affected and displaced. We have a lot of the civilian deaths. The poverty increased sizably in Ukraine. And as we know, during the wars, usually the vulnerable population is the most hit. And, wars don't bring us closer to delivering, sustainable development goals, unfortunately, because wars are pretty toxic for economy. Speaking about the damage in general, that there is a World Bank Rapid Damage Assessment issued in February, is already the 5th edition. And while I continue criticizing the amount of the reconstruction needs, because for me this is not a function of damages, it's a function of post-war vision, but the direct damage is an important figure because it's factual. You know how to to analyze it. There is a methodology, and World Bank has this methodology because you just analyze the satellites images, you see the heat maps of the cities, you see self-reporting, and therefore the figures of the direct damage of the war, and they speak about not economic losses but direct damage for infrastructure, is around $195 billion, which is close to the pre-war GDP. So we lost in 4 years of the war, we lost 1 year GDP for us. And while you look at the map, and I strongly recommend those who have not read, look at the report. It's very rich with figures. We see that the majority effect is not only on the southeast and the main metropolitan cities, because Russia is harassing our cities, during the last years, including energy objects and housing. But we see that the major effect for us is actually coming from social infrastructure and the education, the health, social protection. And this is the major element of the Russia's attack and infrastructure itself. So looking at this as from how all these damages affect the GDP, we know that in 2022, the GDP went substantially down, and despite the growth in the last years after that, we are still more than 20% lower than 2021 GDP. But what is important is, I want to address to you to look at the figures of comparing also to 2014, because we know that the war started that time. And every time when we tried a little bit to go up and to catch up, the results of the Russian aggression, Russia hit again, and we again going down. So when people are comparing us with Poland, for example, it's a little bit unfair comparison, because Poland in the last 20 years at least has not had this kind of external exogenous threat which significantly undermines our growth. Again, this is more like a technical on the figures, quarter by quarter, but we see that there was a big drop. And as you may understand, the major drop in the 2022 was not in the first quarter, because there were still 2 months of the normal operations, and there was only March heavily affecting the first quarter. But even with that, probably if we would see only March as a month, we would see a significant drop. In the peak of those days, up to 80% of Ukrainian entrepreneurs were saying that they were fully or almost fully terminating their economic activities. So the major later effect was in the second quarter, and since then we started going up. But unfortunately, again, due to the Russian strikes on Ukrainian cities and energy objects, we see how from 2023, the economic growth started decelerating. And we know that both consumption and investments and government spending significantly started impacting the GDP growth, so actually coming from internal domestic demand. And when you look later, in terms of investments, which definitely should be productive as investments, but we see that the majority of investments are coming more or less to the replacing or relocating war-affected production facilities, mostly from southeast towards the center of Ukraine or western part of Ukraine. And so it's not only like we're expanding business. Yeah, there are some people are expanding business also during the war. And probably if this would be by industries, you would see also that there is a military is going up. But unfortunately, when what we see in terms of the survey of business, and again, I want to look at to show you in 2014, during the war, 2014, 2015, many people were saying that it's not a good time for investment. Later we went up, after the war, starting in 24, we catch up, with investments until 2021, and later again, now we are on the ongoing down in terms of the investments. And what is more also important is that foreign direct investments, also going down. You see the drop of versus 2022-21, and unfortunately, the investments are not coming. Majority of these, if you analyze by countries, you will see there's usual suspects of most probably businesses which are just recycling money back to the country, which is Cyprus, Netherlands, and a few other countries. What is also a little bit warning as of now is when this is done by IR, the survey of business about the expectations of the business, and unfortunately, despite not despite, but as a part of the war, the expectations of people and businesses are deteriorating now, because the longer war definitely brings a lot of negativism, despite the resilience, a lot of negativism to business. Going a little bit on the industries, on impact on industries, we see one of the major elements of Ukrainian economy before the war is a metallurgy, but due to the loss of several important plants, the factories like Azovstal or Ilycha on the occupied territories, on temporary occupied territories, we see how significantly it went down. And unfortunately, this is a structural effect, because we cannot substitute it. We cannot start producing more on the existing production facilities, because we lost a huge part of that. But at the same time, it's very interesting how we see the change of the economy is impact on the defense sector. We almost didn't have, especially in the private sector, almost didn't have anything in defense sector. And now, our president goes, to Middle East, to other countries, offering what we produce today. And you see the figures of number of companies which are producing drones or producing the different infrastructure with war-affected economy, for sure, because there is a demand now. There is existential risk, and the demand from business goes towards defense sector, and a lot of businesses are focusing there. Even those who were not focusing before on military went there. Another element important for us is grain, and as we know, we are part of the global security, network, food security network. There was a good analysis in 22 how many countries were super dependent on Ukraine, and when the war started and the Black Sea was blocked, and there was a high risk for the major Black Sea ports, including my native Odessa. You see how it dropped in 22. The export through the ports, and I think it was a huge effect first of Ukrainian military, who sent away the Russian fleet from actually Black Sea towards, somewhere to Novorossiysk Canal and further, and also unblocking the Black Sea first through the grain deal, with Turkey, and Russia was also part of that, and later we just unfrozen the Black Sea, which allowed us, more or less to return to the export of grains. But since we lost a part of the territory, temporarily lost part of the territory on the southeast, this substantially affected also our production possibilities, and a lot of our fields, unfortunately, are mined, which also undermine the productivity, agricultural productivity there. Speaking about the trade, what we see is that the gap between the export and imports widens, because of both parts. Because first we have an increase of import, and second, because, as I said, there was export is subdued because metallurgy and agriculture substantially affected, which are two major elements of our export, and it's this. Widening trade gap, only partially, onset with money which are coming from international partners, to help economy. But I will say about this in a few minutes. This is I already said about that. As I said, also the metallurgy and the military substantially increased, the import, especially after last year when we need to pay for import. Since 2025, the U.S. administration stopped providing these more like in kind support to Ukraine. So this is, you see in 25 substantial increase of the military components. Also, due to our attacks on the energy objects, we see significant increase of the import and electricity import. And let's be very frank, it was a huge success that we managed to unite with the European network, electricity network, just weeks before the war. even if it was that time in a test regime. But when the war started, we were interconnected with the Western energy system. And in some time, we even were able to export energy to Moldova and further to Europe. But after the huge attacks started on Ukrainian energy sector, unfortunately, we have to import electricity, which is also part of our balance of payment needs. And my understanding is the last figures were we were importing after these winter attacks up to 2 gigawatts of electricity, because here is the figures are smaller, and we have the maximum capacity of energy grids for importing is around 2.3 gigawatt. Another big, so energy is one of the big obstacles for the economic, growth currently, but the second one is the labor force. And, we have a huge outflow of the people. As I said, we have several million, up to 6 million people, 5.96 million people, according to some official statistics outside of the country. And unfortunately, the longer war, the less number of people is planning to come back. This is a statistics which is done by service. And when you look at the statistic and our statistics on where the majority of people are coming, you see that they are coming mostly from the southeast regions, which are the same more or less map of the damages which is done by the World Bank. So this is like a percentage of people coming from regions. What is important is in 2025 we also have a negative outflow of around 300,000 people, and probably the figures of the first quarter are also negative for us. The refugees and the people, the workers who are currently abroad, start becoming really like an obstacle for the economic growth. And when business is asked, what is your major problem today? And the lack of personnel is said by 67% of the surveyed business. And so it's not like you see the number 3 topic is dangerous to work. So which is more like a threat of the attacks during the working days, or even like interruptions of electricity, which is number 4. So the lack of personnel became number 1 topic. And this is an important signal, because we need to return these people for sure. And we need to work, because otherwise without electricity and without people, it will be almost impossible to recover the further economic growth. Despite all of these damages, both coming from supply and demand side, the National Bank managed to calm down inflation after the war-related shocks, and also after the moment of, let's say, silence from international partners in summer 2022, when we didn't have enough resources, when we saw the drop of economy, drop of the budget revenues, economy was not working, and therefore, but at the same time, you need to finance the war, and the National Bank started printing money in summer 2022. Totally, this was around 400 billion hryvnia, but we know how it affected inflation. And National Bank had to lead immediately to the more tight monetary policy, but they managed to, with the proper policies, they managed to bring down the inflation. Those who understand this, the second up and down, this is regular in the economic policies, how it works, and in monetary policy, how it works. Inflation, when you look at the details of inflation, you see that the major part coming from food and energy prices, and we discussed this already. And food also, since was affected because of the attacks on the south part, which is agricultural part of Ukraine. Banking system remains absolutely operational, working, trusted. Deposits increase. Even during the peak time of the war, the banking sector didn't stop working even for 1 second. And the digital banking, which people have in their hands, the telephones, the trust to the local currency, as you see, is a huge is there. But also lending is increasing in Ukraine. So banking sector start increasing lending despite the war, and this is a super important positive fact. And the banking sector is capitalized. is it's liquid, and it's what is also interesting that the level of the non-performing loans, as you see, despite the war, decreases. So despite the attacks, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but in the end, the banking sector works pretty well. The reserves of the national bank, while being, as I said, affected in the early days of the war, went up. And currently they were already several times on the historical high records, for sure, been fueled by international aid to Ukraine. Hryvnia, for a certain time, was pegged to dollar just to sustain the immediate shock and its immediate, the panic on the market. But later the panic went down. You see the difference with green and blue levels. These are different between the street and let's say the central bank rates, and you see that now is the same. So this is again a good policy of the central bank, good measures of the central bank, which led now to what is named like a managed or controlled floating regime. Budget deficit remains pretty big because the war, impacts, the government actually spending money in order to finance army. And while all the revenues of the budget goes to the, to finance army, the international aid is coming to finance to the social spendings. And this is where the IMF role is pretty huge, because IMF is in the center of international aid, and totally, this is like our baseline and downside scenarios under the IMF program, which was from 2003 to from 2023, and we are now in the new program. But this is what the expected needs for Ukraine. But in the end, Ukraine got $174 billion during the last 4 years only of the international support. This is the figure. You can find these on the Ministry of Finance website, and by country, and the majority coming now from European Union. Also from a group of countries which provided financing Ukraine under so-named ERA loans, which are, it's a financial engineering instrument under using the Russian immobilized assets. US and IMF is the major donors of Ukraine during the war. This year, as of April 2nd, we received already like $10.5 billion attracted from the donors, and total this year we need about 51. And this week, unfortunately, I could not come to you because we have the IMF World Bank spring meetings, and the full delegation was here, including the Prime Minister, discussing with World Bank, IMF, the international support, and all the, countries, 190 countries here. So in the future, we need about $136.5 billion for the next 4 years, from 2006 to 2030. And IMF, again, as I said, in the center, we approved in the end of February, we approved the new program. And these, we are currently delivering. We are now preparing for the first review of money. So IMF program is there. I will not focus on these. And maybe to end, with a few just comments to discuss maybe in the next panel. Still, we don't know how the war will end. There is a lot of efforts, of Ukrainian parties, of the American initiators, European partners, how to end the war. I don't want to stop on the slide, but there are many different scenarios. It's not one avenue for us. There was a good analysis recently done by Valery Pekar and Andrei Dligich about scenarios of end of the war, how they factually moved, all these myriads of scenarios more or less to several ones, depending of if the Ukraine sustains and how the global politics develops, and they come with a more or less probability that more or less like ideas that we come to unstable equilibrium, which means that the war will be still permanently under the risk. And having this war as longer, as I said, we have IMF program, but we also need to think about the reconstruction, because we cannot wait years and years for the reconstruction, because as I said, more people spend time outside of the country, less probable they come back. Recently, OECD issued an interesting report on architecture for reconstruction, and we need really to think and this is from World Bank website, World Bank presentation. We need to think how to phase and plan this reconstruction and how to institutionalize it. And we discussed this from 2022, factually how to go through this, and the European Union accession for sure is a big part of that, but reconstruction is an independent process, is overlapping with EU accession, but not necessarily, a 100% integral part of that. In our words, no matter our speed to European Union, we need to do reconstruction anyway fast. And for that, there is a lot of the institutional frame should be done. And I was speaking about that in Harvard with Ricardo Hausmann class in the past, and we already discussed it there. I'm happy to continue this discussion in the next panel. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Vlad. There's not much time left in this session, but we'll have ample opportunity to direct questions to you in the general discussion. Let me just raise a few points. One has to do with the labor shortages that you've mentioned, and particularly because of the large number of Ukrainians living abroad. And what has there been an effort made beyond pushing for an end to the war, especially the bees defeat the bear scenario, which I like the title of, has there been an effort, even while the war is underway, to try to recruit people to come back, not just through economic incentives, but through appeals to patriotism and others? I'm thinking in particular of some of those who are highly specialized in certain sectors of the economy. With regard to the defense industry, and I don't know, is Michael Kaufman still here? The one thing that I am curious about is how did this come about? Because Ukraine did have important factories during the Soviet period, and those continued to operate, although somewhat disjointedly in the post-Soviet period. But suddenly you have the rise of these private companies using sometimes fairly simple technology to achieve very advanced aims, but also some who are really dealing with advanced technologies. And where did this come from? Because you wouldn't have expected it, say, if you look at the experience back in 2014, but even more recently. And so if you could comment on that, the rise of the military sector. Another question, you referred to the attacks on energy facilities, but I'm particularly interested in how attacks on nuclear power, or at least occupation of nuclear power, Zaporizhzhia, and how that has affected Ukrainian energy provision, because the hydrocarbons is something where Ukraine had depended quite heavily on external sources, the Russian government included. But I'm wondering, how has the nuclear energy sector been affected? I think I'm running out of time, so let me cut it there. We'll come back with more questions. If I could very quickly, I guess I still have 1 minute. So let me add one other question, which has to do with the question of aid and working with the IMF, because you're obviously the best person to ask about this, to what extent are you finding with the Ukrainian officials you deal with that they believe that the IMF is truly going to come through, or do they think that they need to work with other international organizations or simply bilaterally with various European governments? It looks like the U.S. government, at least for the next few years, is not going to be a real outlet, although perhaps if there is a settlement of the war, that will change even before the current administration is gone. So if you could think about how the Ukrainian officials that you're dealing with conceive of the opportunities they have with the IMF versus other international organizations. Okay.
Later.
Yes, we'll come back to the, don't worry, Vlad, we'll come back to this during the general discussion. So let me thank you again.